Thanks, Lula, and thanks everybody for having me here today. It's great to get the first public outing of the research that has kept me very busy for the last 6 or 7 years anyway. I want to start the presentation by setting the context a little bit about this research and what I've been doing over the past few years. So as a practitioner, I would say at the coalface in this field, I've been really amazed in the last number of years at the use of the word lifelong learning and how it has really exploded in the Irish context. But it always intrigues me to see the concept used or understood in quite different ways. So when I started looking at ideas for my doctoral thesis, I thought it would be really interesting to try and get under the bonnet of it and see what people really understand lifelong learning to mean in the higher education context, in particular in Ireland. So the two key research questions for my work are here on the screen. How is lifelong learning conceptualised among senior stakeholders within the Irish higher education system? And how do these stakeholders think that lifelong learning in Irish higher education can be enhanced? The core assumption of my study derived from literature in the field of management studies, where the perspective of senior stakeholders tends to influence priorities and strategies within their organisations. So to some degree then, lifelong learning in the Irish higher education sector would be shaped by the views of key stakeholders. In terms of the theoretical framing of my study, I would categorise myself as a critical theorist, which won't be of any surprise to those of you who know me. For those of you unfamiliar with critical theorists offer more than just criticism. They advocate for change in order to try and improve society. And that's exactly what my research is focused on, trying to change the higher education sector for the better. In terms of the methodology used in this study, I adopted a phenomenographic approach to my work, whereby phenomenography, as described by Martin, is a research method for mapping qualitatively different ways in which people experience, conceptualise, perceive, and understand various aspects of and phenomena in the world around them. So in essence, in this study, I'm interested not in the concept of lifelong learning per se, but in the various ways that stakeholders conceptualise lifelong learning, specifically in the Irish higher education context. As this is the first time that key stakeholders in the Irish context have been the focus of such a study, I wanted to try and ensure to have a very wide breadth of organisations included as much as possible in the constraints of the time I had available for the thesis. So over several months, I interviewed senior staff in a range of organisations, including DeFerris, the HEA, QQI, presidents from HEIs, leaders from the IUA, from PEA, members of Helen, the SM Lifelong Learning Hub, researchers and heads of lifelong learning or adult education units in Irish HEIs, representatives from AMPAS and from SOLUS. So it was a busy few months of interviewing. The first research question then I tried to focus on is how is lifelong learning conceptualised among senior stakeholders within the Irish higher education system? And through analysing almost 20 hours of interview transcripts, I eventually narrowed down my findings to 3 categories, which to me display the categorically different ways that the participants in my research conceptualise lifelong learning in the Irish higher education context. And I'll take you through each of those categories in turn. So the first category identified is what I have called an idealistic, values-focused conception of lifelong learning in higher education. So in this category, lifelong learning is defined as an idea or a philosophy that shapes the whole higher education system, as well as being a tool for developing opportunities for learning for a plethora of different reasons. The target audience is all-encompassing. It's for everyone and anyone looking to learn for whatever reason. And the idea here is that higher education should serve the whole population and anyone who is interested in learning in a higher education institution. Not everyone will be, of course, but anyone who wants to should be able to find a pathway through. The role of higher education is seen as providing holistic opportunities and supports for a wide range of learners. And somewhat surprisingly, the key driver of lifelong learning in higher education is seen here to be the economy and skills agenda. Even though many of the research participants were kind of loath to say it and felt that this was the wrong driver for lifelong learning. So let's take a closer look at what some of the stakeholders had to say in this category. In terms of defining lifelong learning, the head of an adult education and lifelong learning unit in an Irish university said that lifelong learning is the capacity to be always open and developing as an adult in terms of your emotional, your psychological, your cognitive, your spiritual capacity. For a senior representative from the IUA, lifelong learning is a culture and a way of being, as well as a principle and maybe the actions themselves. So back to that idea of lifelong learning being a philosophy as well as a tool. A senior official from De Ferris describes the broad audience and how lifelong learning is for anyone looking to update, to upskill, reskill, understand more, develop particular transversal skills, the whole sort of gamut of things that obviously education and participation in higher education can deliver. A university president describes the role of higher education in lifelong learning and argues that lifelong learning is more than that aspect of skills development, or it should be, and it should encompass a role in shaping people's values and philosophy. So here we're seeing the argument that lifelong learning is broader than just skills for the labour market. In terms of the driver for lifelong learning in higher education, a university president explains the importance of the income generating aspects of lifelong learning for HEAs and says unless the numbers add up, it will be very difficult to persuade anybody to move into this space because it is such a big change. But it's the incorrect driver. It's the incorrect reason for doing it. In a similar way, the head of an adult education or lifelong learning unit in a HEI said, "It's not where I think we should be at. We're racing to the bottom with a lot of the stuff that we do because we're so driven by numbers and income. I really do feel we end up being very much so show me the money, and that's where we're going." So there's somewhat of a tension here between the kind of idealistic intention of lifelong learning and then the economic reality in our institutions. The second category that can be used to explain how lifelong learning is conceptualised is what I have termed a pragmatic, operations-focused conception that differs from the idealism of the first category. Here, lifelong learning is defined as a practical tool for developing opportunities for learning in the broad sense, but primarily focused on opportunities for learning for career development. There's a perception here that lifelong learning should be for everyone, but in reality, higher education is primarily focused on those interested in learning for career development. The role of higher education is seen as providing more flexible opportunities and pathways for learners as just one part of a much broader lifelong learning ecosystem. And finally, the key driver of lifelong learning again is seen as the economy and skills agenda, whereby HEIs are focused on offerings related to career development to generate money. Looking at what some of the stakeholders had to say in this category, representative from Solus, looking in at the HE sector from outside, I suppose, describes how lifelong learning offerings in higher education are very much weighted in that skills, industry-focused labour market requirement space. A senior official from De Ferris describes how this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as skills are a driver of societal well-being, as well as being a driver of economic well-being, as well, and there are correlations between employment prospects, risk of poverty, social cohesion, and individual well-being. A representative from Solus describes the target audience focus as the skills focus, labour market focus, make yourself better, get a better job out of doing it. It's people's ambition, it's fulfilling that ambition that people have for themselves so that their companies have for them. In terms of the role of higher education in this category, the head of an adult education unit in an Irish HEI explains that for me, it's all about pathways and structuring it appropriately or creating those structures so that people can choose the best pathway for them. While a very accomplished lifelong learning researcher outlines how lifelong learning is in a very big universe and higher education is only one part of that. And I think we have to be quite sensitive and humble in higher education that we are just one part of this universe. And I think we have to be humble because sometimes we think of ourselves, because we're higher education, that we're somehow at the pinnacle, and we're not. We're just part of a complex landscape. Finally, in terms of the key driver for lifelong learning in higher education, a senior representative from the HEA described how HEIs have realised that lifelong learning is a significant source of income on top of their regular funding because public higher education funding has been reducing. So all in all, a quite pragmatic assessment of lifelong learning in higher education. The final category then that my research uncovered is quite a narrow labour market skills-focused conception of lifelong learning. Here, lifelong learning is defined as a form of CPD activity to respond to skills needs in the economy. The target audience is seen as professionals or graduates looking to upskill and not new entrants to higher education. The role of higher education is purely to respond to skills needs in the economy through the creation of focused upskilling opportunities. And unsurprisingly, the driver is seen as the economy and skills agenda. So let's see what the interviewees had to say in this category. The president of one Irish university described how lifelong learning is not a term I use myself because I think from my point of view it's too broad. It's everything from wine tasting to an M-Eng and cleanroom technology, so that's way too broad. I don't actually like the term. I'm in the space of continuous professional development. That's what we're good at, that's what we know about. Agreeing with this view that lifelong learning should be defined as a CPD type activity, a senior representative from the HEA asked, what other lifelong learning are you talking about if it isn't economy focused? In terms of the target audience, a senior representative from the HEA outlined how lifelong learning to me is anything post-graduation that continues throughout your employment career. So here you would first need to be a graduate to then engage in lifelong learning. In terms of the role of higher education, a representative from the HEA outlines how higher education has changed significantly in the last couple of years. I think it was mainly seen in higher education institutions as kind of a part-time study, very formal, could take a long number of years, but that's changed. I think now it's all about providing shorter, sharper type intervals of learning for people who are in employment mainly. Finally, in terms of the driver for lifelong learning, a representative from the HEA argued that it's the money stream that I think is really kind of waking institutions up to the opportunities of providing lifelong learning because it could be very lucrative. And companies do have quite big training budgets that HEI can avail of. A university president agreed and quite plainly said, we're in that game to make money. Quite a bit of a contrast between the more idealistic conception outlined in the first category. So now we've discussed the three different categories, but how do they relate to each other? Well, as the most holistic category, category A, the idealistic values-focused conception, is the all-encompassing category, with category B and C forming subsets of category A. So I think what this demonstrates is that the skills for the labour market agenda is an important part of lifelong learning, but it's not fair to say that lifelong learning simply equates to skills for work. In the literature, there's sometimes somewhat of a dichotomy created between this holistic and humanistic idea of lifelong learning on one side and the skills agenda on the other. But I don't agree that that's particularly fair or indeed helpful. I don't think we should be looking at an either-or concept. The skills agenda is important and does not need to be portrayed as the enemy to the humanistic approach. But similarly, I would argue that it's critical that other aspects of lifelong learning relating to personal development or community development or learning focused on societal issues or learning in the third age are not excluded in a skills for work only model. I would argue that lifelong learning needs to be focused on learning for living and not just learning for earning. And indeed, that seems to be the consensus among the participants in this study, where the perspectives of the majority of interviewees aligned with category A, a minority of participants with category B, and then a very, very small minority aligned with category C. So overall then, my research has found that there does seem to be convergence towards a dominant school of thought around lifelong learning in Irish higher education, which is framed in the ideas of category A. Now, while in theory that all sounds very promising, I'm afraid the reality, as I'm sure all of you will know, the reality as portrayed by participants in my study is rather different. And we still have quite a bit to go to try and achieve that idealistic version of lifelong learning portrayed in category A. So that's where my second question comes in. According to the key stakeholders, how could lifelong learning in higher education be enhanced? So I devised a framework for enhancing lifelong learning in higher education in our country, and at the very heart of this model is what learners need. And while I think there are many things that they need, at the very core of their needs are two key things: an awareness of the importance of lifelong learning and encouragement to engage in it, and then the removal of barriers to participation. So how can we achieve that in our sector? Well, I think we need both the government and the higher education sector to commit to lifelong learning and undertake several key steps. So on the government side, we need really to try and develop and drive a national culture of lifelong learning. This was called out by multiple participants in this study and has also been highlighted in the recent OECD skills review of Ireland's skills strategy. Without the promotion of lifelong learning on a national scale, it's going to be difficult for many people to truly appreciate the importance of engaging in lifelong learning, either in higher education or in other contexts. We need the government to try and help create conditions for success in lifelong learning. Ideas that surfaced in this study include the need for a national independent guidance service, which would be made available to everyone in the population who's outside of formal education. Such an approach to building a service for lifelong guidance would help to increase awareness of lifelong learning among potential learners, as well as helping them to try and navigate their route to entry, something that we all see is a barrier to many potential learners. And then this will also try and increase their chances of securing positive outcomes once they're in the right course from the beginning. The state also needs to explore ways of incentivising both learners and higher education institutions to actively engage in lifelong learning in higher education. One way of doing this would be to fund part-time students on an equal basis to full-time students, as was suggested in the Castles report. Perhaps it might be worth exploring whether part-time learners who meet certain eligibility criteria could be funded on a per-credit basis rather than on the basis of the type of awards they sign up to, which has recently been mooted by the Ferris. Such an approach would speak to the demands for flexibility and agility, particularly in the context of the increasing movement around micro-credentials. I would also strongly encourage the reintroduction of the SUSI grant for part-time learners, as was also highlighted in the final report of the recent review of this scheme carried out by Indicon. Again, this would be a targeted initiative that would benefit those most in need. Higher education institutions themselves will also need to be incentivised to engage in the lifelong learning agenda. And one way of doing this would be to remove the distinction between part-time and full-time programmes in allocating the core grant to HEIs. If increased funding flowed to HEIs for the provision of part-time and flexible offerings, it's likely such provision would increase, thereby benefiting learners. Finally, like numerous participants in this research, I think one of the first things the state needs to do moving forward the lifelong learning agenda is to create the space for a national dialogue around lifelong learning. While it is undoubtedly useful for us to be guided by the international organisations, and the OECD report on Ireland's skills strategy that was published last year is helpful in informing the debate, I think that there is still value in inviting all the stakeholders within the lifelong learning ecosystem to the table. Education and training providers, civil society organisations, employer groups, trade unions, everybody, to try and engage in a robust discussion on the future of lifelong learning in Ireland. And we don't need to be concerned about the output being a policy or a strategy or a national vision per se, but it could at least be helpful in setting the course collectively of where we want to go in the next several decades. Something similar to what the UK did with the Centenary Commission on Adult Education in 2019. On the higher education side then, there's also work for us to do as a sector. We really need to promote and embrace the lifelong learning agenda. There's an urgent need for leadership in HEIs to really move beyond the traditional view of the HE sector student population and embrace opportunities to widen access to all elements of Irish society. Rather than just cursory references to lifelong learning in their strategic plans, HEIs need to actively pursue change to promote the lifelong learning agenda. There is no doubt that it's going to be a challenging endeavour, and the issue of resources, we all know, will not be easily overcome without government support. but the demonstration of a true commitment to lifelong learning by the senior leadership of our HEIs would be transformative for the sector. We also need to try and help create the conditions for success in lifelong learning on our side. For lifelong learning to really thrive in our sector, there is a need for some fundamental changes on how we do things. Firstly, in order to vastly improve flexibility and agility in the sector, systems enhancements are going to be a necessity. IT systems like student record systems will need to be improved to cope with the increased complexity around managing the records of students who don't sign up to a major award day one, but perhaps dip in and out of various HEIs across their life course. The work that has recently started around developing FE-HE pathways needs to continue apace to ensure that we have a more joined up tertiary system, which allows learners to move seamlessly between different actors in the lifelong learning ecosystem. Consideration will also need to be given to modes of delivery and timetables for higher education courses to introduce greater flexibility, to better support those for whom learning is just one of many priorities in their lives, among work and family responsibilities and all the rest of the issues that we hear about on a daily basis. But the focus shouldn't only be on course delivery. Thought is also needed around how supports can be offered to those learning in flexible ways. There's a pressing need for nuanced supports for non-traditional learners who can't access campus supports during daytime office hours. We also, as a sector, have a significant role to play in contributing to the National Lifelong Learning Agenda. One of the primary roles of our sector is to produce research, but research that's published looking at our own sector and critiquing our own sector is sparse in comparison to other disciplines. So we need more research highlighting good practices of lifelong learning in higher education, the impact of lifelong learning in higher education on learners, on employers, on broader society, the return on investment for government funding for lifelong learning initiatives in higher education, and critical analysis of lifelong learning related policies and strategies. And all of that could really add significant value to the enhancement of lifelong learning in higher education in Ireland, because it would help to build a body of evidence for the sector and for political leaders to draw upon to inform their decision making. Furthermore, there is a need for those currently involved in lifelong learning within HEIs to amplify their voices. And that there is ours. Everybody in this room, we need to amplify our voices. As practitioners at the coalface of lifelong learning in higher education, we are the ones who can perhaps offer the greatest insight into the challenges and opportunities for the sector. One way this can be achieved is through increased collective action. There is huge potential for Helen to really drive the change needed in this sector, to lobby government and advocate for the needs of lifelong learners in higher education, and to be a central voice in the National Lifelong Learning Agenda discourse. So what can make all this happen? Firstly, this framework is founded upon three key guiding principles. Learner centricity, so we keep the learners at the heart of every decision that we make. Equality, diversity and inclusion, to ensure that access to lifelong learning in higher education is given to the whole of Irish society, not just those in employment. Respect for institutional autonomy, to appreciate the different ways that individual institutions can best contribute to the National Lifelong Learning Agenda in accordance with the needs of their own regions. We don't all need to be doing the same thing. The beauty in our work comes from the creativity and innovation, and we certainly don't want to try and stifle that, but rather create the conditions for that creativity to thrive. There are also several key enablers that will drive this work. Leadership and political will to enable the enhancement of lifelong learning in higher education is critically important, and such leadership is needed at both government and HEI level. The availability of resources is a vital issue. Significant investment is now required for lifelong learning in higher education. The final key enabler recognised in this framework is the need for creativity and innovation. For lifelong learning in our sector to truly succeed, we need to move away from how we have always done things in this sector and start to innovate. I think there's a really strong opportunity here for a re-energised Helen network to make a strong contribution to the enhancement of our field going forward. So all I can say is keep fighting a good fight for all of our learners, the very wide breadth of them. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.